Welcome to Why Am I Like This? It's a Venus day in Australia. It's a moon night of Jupiter day in the Americas. And it's the 5th of April, also in Australia. And this is a container called Why Am I Like This? Which is a container in the Broom Radio where I hold space for transmitted responses to questions that have been posed to me and have been offered to the container of Why Am I Like This. I'm very aware of the lack of hyphenation in audio right now because I'm like 3 hyphens deep. But I'm just going to continue from a soul complex that I call Red Star Green Cloud, or a depiction of the astral body of the celestial body known as Sirius C, which I also know as the soul complex of the heart of the astral body of Sekhmet. But yeah, please disagree. I know there are some lineages that relate Sirius to other beings, and I've been meaning to tune into that to understand what the relationship between, say, Sopdet is and Sekhmet. But I don't think I'm going to do it in this container, because for this container, I'm bringing in a question from a member of the Broom and attender and gardener of the Broom named Lexi. And the question is, if I can scroll past all the parts of the chat where we're talking about Furby divination. Yes, the question is, what do you think of the saying, we can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny? What do you think of the saying, quote, we can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny, unquote, question mark. I'm curious to hold space. I want to hold space for y'all to like add anything or offer responses or additional questions to the container of this question. And while I'm doing that, I'll repeat the guarantee of this container, which is that no contexts will be enmeshed in the space and time of this container, including the space and time of those who are listening to this container while they are in, I'll say, like the awareness space of this container, outside of space and time. I'm not trying to confuse y'all, I'm just trying to be very specific. And I guarantee that contexts will be disenmeshed in the space and time of this container, including the space and time of those who are listening to this container while they're listening to this container and while they're in the awareness space of this container. Which is to say that context will not be enmeshed while your awareness touches this container. And while your awareness is touching this container, contexts may become disenmeshed, which is to say that metaphysical harm will not occur while your awareness is conjoined with or touching this container, and that metaphysical healing will occur while your awareness is conjoined with and or touching this container. And I'm still guaranteeing I guarantee that I will hold space for good faith offerings of refinement with regard to this guarantee, or with respect to the container at all, or in any way. We have some Furby updates. I'm going to look at the chat and see if there are any updates to the question container. Adam, who is also a member of the Broom and a tender of the Broom, even though he's trying to get out of the ladder recently, says, I feel like a lot is going to hinge on what, quote, fate, quote, unquote, and, quote, destiny, unquote, are. But I'm feeling into the bigger question, I think, of what has maybe lots of potentialities and what has less or even zero. Dang, I feel like you basically answered the question already. Kind of. I feel like you didn't. But I mean, you did answer the question. Or what I should say to be more accurate is that I feel like where you're going with that is very aligned with the general direction that I'll say, like, I usually go when I think about this question. But I feel like I might not necessarily only go there. But I also feel like the way that I'm framing this directional alignment also relates to how I'm going to respond to the question, which I'll repeat just because I've been digressing a lot. Lexi asks, what do you think of the saying, quote, we can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny, unquote? And I'll repeat some aspects of what Adam said. I'm feeling into the bigger question, square bracket, dot, 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 square bracket, of what has maybe lots of potentialities and what has less or even zero. Cool. So I'm still going to hold space for any kind of text stuff. I'm really looking forward to going back and remembering which Furbies y'all were associated with by Lexi. But I'll do that later. Um, so first of all, I'll say that, like, when Lexi called this the saying, there was like a little bit of a thingy in my field, like a little bit of a boom. You know, like if y'all have seen like Jurassic Park, I feel like there's a scene where like there's a glass of water or like a water bottle on the dashboard of like Sam Neill's like Durago or whatever, Suzuki Vitara perhaps. And then like the dinosaur is like coming, and then like you see like the water kind of like reflects some sort of like vibrational resonance. And I feel like there was a little bit of that when I read the part of Lexi's question which said the saying, because I don't know if that's actually a saying. Like, is that a saying for y'all? And like, what does it mean? Yeah, so like, I was gonna say, what does it mean for it to be a saying? And Huda says, I haven't heard it before. So, I feel like when something's a saying, it means that, like, I'd say, like, you've probably heard it a number of times, but I don't feel like that's necessarily adequately constraining the field of what it means for a saying to be a saying. Because I don't think you would say, like, if someone says hello, you'd be like, oh, I've heard that saying before. That's like just something you say, but it's not a quote saying, unquote. So I feel like it has to be something, I would say, like, for most people, it has to be something you've heard before in the material realm, or like you've seen it written down before. And it has to be said with like a certain energy, like a certain gravitas. Um, I feel like this saying in itself doesn't necessarily have all of that gravitas, but I would say that like statements which are phrased pseudo objectively, or like, without qualifying for perspective, which I talked a little bit about in the last one of my like this on predictions and manifestation. But if I were to say, all of us can change our fate, but not our destiny, or all of us can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny, I would say that like that takes up perspective, which is not necessarily well constrained to the perspective of the person who's saying it. And I feel like semiotically, or I should say semantically, it's not so different from saying we can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny, because you know, within some lineages, people would say that if you're talking about we, you're just, like you're talking to about the people to whom this refers. And then in some lineages, people would say, like, if you're talking about we, you're talking about all of the people here. Or I'd say in some contexts, people would say when you're talking about we, you're talking about all the people who are standing behind you and sort of like nodding when you say something because they're in your cult or something like that. But, if I say all of us, I feel like that has like a slightly different astral projection, which includes more perspective than the word we. And if you were to say something like destiny can be changed, but fate cannot be changed, then I would say that there is no qualification, like there is no explicit subject of that sentence. And therefore, like the statement is pseudo objective. And I guess, like, before I go further, including reading what y'all have said so far, I'll ask, like, if you hold those three statements in front of you in some way, like somatically or visually, or like however you access, um, like your inner perception, let's call it, or your intuition. Like the first one is like, we can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny. And the second one is, all of us can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny. And then the third one is, destiny can be changed, but fate cannot be changed. I'm curious, like, if you can kind of feel on some level what I mean when I talk about like the various spaces and times that those perspectives occupy. Or you could say, like, how pervasive are the containers of each of those statements relative to one another? Adam says, for sure, all three have very different vibes for me. Julie says, up arrow. Well, not really, but it's that character. I'm not sure what that character's called. Well, this says, they all feel different in their degree of understanding of fate, destiny, and we, us, selfhood. Ooh, that's very specific. Thank you. I was mostly talking about like the we, us, selfhood / perspective parameter, but I think you're right that they also have different, say, textural. I'll say like they have different perspectives of fate and destiny, which emanate from, let's call it, like the barycenter of their respective selfhoods in the context of fate and destiny. And I recently learned of that term from Adam, so thank you for that. Yeah, Julie says, like who is being addressed? I think that's exactly what I mean by like the barycenter, or even just like the shape of the perspective that is being occupied by each of those statements. Oh yes, the up arrow is called a caret. Thank you, Adam. Adam says, with we, I always go to like the human collective level when it's in a big sentence like that one. And yeah, I mean the center of mass of the container of that perspective, of that statement. Julie says the third phrase, which is the one which doesn't have a subject explicitly in it, feels like a creator thing and not an us, human, or being thing. Exactly. I would say that aligns with my perspective exactly. um, so yeah. So I feel like the amount of like, I'll say, space time or perspective which is like occupied by a perspective or an assertion, or occupied by the container of a statement, often contributes a lot to like whether it becomes a quote saying unquote or not. And then I feel like context matters, and then like the person who's saying it or like the medium of how it's transmitted also matters, right? Like if it's in a book, it has more gravitas, it has more influence. And I would say that that's because we project that books contain statements that a lot of people agree with because historically that was the case, right? Like in order for you to get something published, you had to convince a lot of people that it was true, or you probably had a lot of money, which probably meant that a lot of people agreed with you generally. So anything that you said in printed form was likely to be more true, or at least more, I'll say, intersubjectively or interpersonally believed to be true. And sometimes that happened because you were rich, so people were like, oh yeah, like I'm going to say this person's right, so I can kind of lick up some of the crumbs that fall from their table. But I feel like the specter or the shadow of those associations with things which are printed in books in a particular way lends more gravitas to a statement. I'd say that if it's set in a serifed typeface, it tends to have more gravitas in most people's perception. And I would say that the way that things are published nowadays is very different. And so that probably leads to inaccurate projection about how believable something is based on the medium it comes in or whoever's talking about it. But then also like the lexical aspects of how a perspective is phrased also contribute to that gravitas. And then I would say like, of course, like whether or not something is considered to be a saying or not is going to depend upon each person and their experience or lack of experience of that saying. Like, did they see it in a tweet? Did they see it in a book? Did they see it coming out of someone's mouth, or did they hear it coming out of someone's mouth, or did they see it coming out of someone's mouth and their entire body when they were saying it? And of course, other people are going to have different experiences of that. And then, of course, other people are going to assign, I'll say, pun intended, different weights to different aspects of where they experience that quote saying, unquote. And those are all going to contribute to different experiences of that assertion. And then that's all going to create different experiences, I'll say, downstream of that assertion, which is to say that that assertion is going to have some kind of different karmic influence on their field. And that karmic influence is going to change the way that that person perceives reality, whether it's like knowingly or unknowingly through the lens of that assertion, based on the influence of that assertion in their field, based on all of these characteristics and more that I've named and have not named. And I would say that, and that we kind of talked about this in the last time, I like this container on predictions, but I would say that the way that that karma reifies itself in one's perception can lead to different timelines being experienced and different choices being made at different times. And even, I would say, if the statement has significant enough karma or gravitas or influence, can lead to the perception or the lack of perception of different possibilities. So, I feel like in many ways, in why am I like this, I always give y'all some ammunition to come at me and tell me that I'm being energetically unhygienic in these containers. But I hope that what I'm saying sheds a bit more light on what I call enmeshment of context. and disenmeshment of contact. And therefore, with that light, you can subject my body of work to scrutiny with regard to my guarantee that contexts will not be enmeshed and contexts will be disenmeshed. Not because I'm a sucker for punishment, not because I feel like y'all love to throw stones at heretics, but because if I'm going to be heretical, I want to be as clean as possible. And also because being clean in the way that I am heretical gives me a great amount of joy. And also because any lack of cleanliness in my output as a heretic probably comes from distortion that's taking up space in my field. So if y'all can like show me that distortion and I can release it, then I get to be more me. And I love being me. So when I say please disagree, it's in a spirit that aligns with all of those statements. And it's in a spirit which I feel like could be clumsily likened to self-love and love for y'all. But you'll probably notice I'm not the kind of person to either start or end or intersperse my assertions with assertions of loving people. Because I'd say most of the time that comes from a place of attachment, aka is love bombing. But there is a spirit of disagreement and agreement in all of my containers, which I hope y'all can feel, and you can call it whatever you want. And it may be accurate to you, and it's almost guaranteed to be inaccurate to somebody else. So I'll just like close that little container on what a saying is, and I'll leave that in the container of this question, and y'all can join your awareness with it whenever y'all want. And I'm going to go back to the outer container of this question, which is, what do I think about the saying, we can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny? And I'll read what Hoda said. I feel like what's coming up for me regarding the question of fate and destiny is around how one defines either one. Boom. Very good. Julie says, fate seems like a fraction of destiny to me. Thank you. This is very true. And I feel like it aligns with what Adam was saying. Adam says it gives me Instagram vibes. I have no idea what that's in reference to, but I'm going to take that as a compliment. Lexi says, I have heard of it before, but I felt called to ask it because of that thread you posted, and then I joked and said, I think it's my destiny that I'm going to put it as a question for why am I like this? Should take that to predictions, Lexi, because it happened. You didn't predict that I'd actually answer the question, but I feel like I guaranteed at some point that I'll answer every question. Why am I like this? But I would say you can't claim that as a prediction, just the part where you ask it. Hannah says, I think fate can be changed and destiny can't. Is that counterintuitive? Oh, that's what you're saying. Yes, that is what I'm saying. But it's not also not just what I'm saying, it's what the person who I learned that statement from was saying. And I'm not saying the saying, I'm just repeating it. And then I'm going to read out a thread that I wrote that Lexi was referring to. Thank you, Lexi. Probably the most effective archivist of the space we call the broom, and the only one. Oh, it's a thread because it's on threads, but it's not really a thread because it's just one tweet. But it goes, quote, one of my earliest teachers, an acupuncturist and movement teacher, said, we can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny. I have more complex takes on this. And I've only got like give or take like 20 minutes. But so I'm just reading some of the back scroll and all this bullshit I was talking about, like fonts and books. Well, it says wingdings never stood a chance. Adam says wingdings is playing the long game. I feel like both of those statements are true. I also feel like wingding sounds like a racist slur against Chinese people, and it's funny to me. Like, I kind of want to open up a Chinese restaurant called Wingdings now, just for y'all. But I don't want to work in a restaurant again. Um. Anyway, so I learned. I'll say that, like, I'm not going to call it a saying because I feel like sayings tend to accumulate karma, and I don't like that. And it's not just because it's like a guarantee I make in this container, but I first heard that said to me on a Zoom call with a person named Jonwin Lee, who is an acupuncturist, a movement teacher, and also a practitioner of astrology coming from Chinese traditions or traditions that are associated with China. And it was one call in a series that was being proposed on Chinese astrology, which I stopped attending, and I feel like he might have stopped putting it on. This is like in the early days of COVID, so I want to say maybe like June or May 2020. And, people were just sort of figuring out like what to do with their lives. And I think people who are used to teaching spiritual stuff, especially movement stuff, or practicing in lineages which require physical contact, were sort of scrambling to maintain their livelihoods because they didn't live in countries like America where the government was supplementing the income of people who had stable employment, which I would say is also a half measure, approximately, because a lot of people who need things do not have stable employment, and a lot of people who receive those supplements probably didn't need them as much as people who did not receive those supplements, especially if we're talking about practitioners who live in countries where they don't have very strong social security nets, like Bali. Um, so it was in this context that I first came into contact with Jonwin Lee through a teacher who's known as David, or Dance of the Dragon on YouTube. And it was in the context of a Chinese astrology course that Jonwin Lee said, "In my traditions, it is said that you can change your fate, but you can't change your destiny." And going back to what I was saying about sayings and what lends them gravitas, I'll say when someone says "in my traditions" or "my people say," I would say that tends to lend a huge amount of gravitas to the statement that someone's making, if that person is in a context where their traditions or their lineages are seen as smaller or outgrouped compared to the overculture. Like if you're in like white America and like, like Bob with the trucker hat and the truck nuts was to say like, "Oh, my people say X, Y, and Z," you'd probably laugh at that person, right? But in the context that we were in, I would say most of the people in that Zoom call were like in Western countries. And John Wynn, I think, is like a Thai person of Chinese descent living in Bali. So for him to say, "In my traditions, we say that you can change your fate, but you can't change your destiny," added to its gravitas and possibly led to me repeating it more often. Anna says there's a Wingdings in Boston, so that's really great because now I don't have to do that. The joke has already been made. Please enjoy. Is it like a chicken restaurant, Anna? Yes. Great. Perfect. That's exactly. Yeah. So I'm relieved of my duty. Is it like a Chinese chicken restaurant? I mean, the reason I kind of think like it was sort of like a Chinese slur to call that typeface wingding is because like it's kind of just like nonsense, which is probably what Chinese like script looks like to most people. But like this could be a projection of, I would say, experiences that I've had of being racially discriminated against, which I'm projecting onto perspectives which created a typeface and called it wingdings, which I would be projecting inaccurately, or it could be accurately. We're talking about predictions. And like I'm just like waffling on, and that's kind of like a pun I'm intending, like chicken and waffle. But like I'm kind of waffling on about different things. But Lexi found a video on it, which is great. Like you can all just like listen to this video instead of listening to me talking about it. But Lexi asked specifically, what do I think about the saying? And I'm talking very specifically and very discursively and in a very not focused but yet very specific way about what I think about this saying. And y'all are probably like, I'm never going to tune into a container when Nobu is asked to say what he thinks about anything, because he's just going to continue talking around it in very specific and like somewhat interesting ways, but he's never going to answer the question. And I assure you that I am going to answer the question. And I've probably answered a lot of questions that y'all didn't even have, but maybe you would have had if I hadn't answered them. But now you don't have to have those questions, or maybe you still have more questions. And I would love if you offer those questions to the container of why am I like this, so I can answer them or not answer them another time. I'm completely sober, by the way. I know a lot of people talk like this when they're wasted, but I'm completely sober. I'm only under the influence of a small amount of caffeine. But anyway, what do I think about this question? So I was talking about having met Jonwin Lee, who I believe is still practicing different energy working modalities in Bali. And I would say that regardless of him being in sort of like a marginalized out group and saying, in my traditions, we say that you can't change your fate. Fuck, I'm messing it up. In my traditions, we say that we can't change our destiny, but we can change our fate. We can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny. I'd say, like, regardless of him saying, in my traditions, and referring to a marginalized out group, I would say that this statement felt true to me based on our shared lineages. My shared lineage with Jonwin's shared lineage. And I would say that what Julie and Adam said, both of those statements gesture in the direction of my perspective of what this means. And I feel like it's important to relate it to astrology because I feel like we can be even more specific about what it means for fate to be, I would say in Julie's words, a fraction of destiny. And I feel like we can be even more specific about what Adam sort of referred to as like the range between 0 or 1 possibilities and many possibilities. And I feel like I'm paraphrasing that. So I'm going to first recount my impressions of the experience I had with Jonwin. Separately, you could say I'm putting it in a container lexically and pre-lexically or energetically. And to shed more light on the container in which he said that, I'll say that he was talking about the uses of astrology. And I would say that despite our shared lineages, I wouldn't say that my understanding of the uses of astrology overlaps completely with his understanding of the uses of astrology. But he was talking specifically about horary. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, because if not, then I'm pronouncing it in a way that invokes the egregore of prostitution. But horary, as opposed to what he saw, and I think this aligns with my perception of the practice of astrology in current time, and I would say in more Western lineages, which he referred to and I refer to as natal astrology. And he was talking about how, broadly speaking, horary is used to help us make decisions. And it was in this context in which he said we can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny. Because he was trying to talk about how people would sometimes come to practitioners of Chinese astrology and the specific tradition of horary in Chinese astrology, which I'll note is very hard to say for people who come from Chinese linguistic backgrounds, because of the way that the H sound does and doesn't show up in those languages, and the way that the R sound does and doesn't show up in those languages, which is also common to how it does and doesn't show up in Japanese, where H's are often pronounced almost like F and R's are almost pronounced like L. But despite all of these linguistic difficulties, he was laboring to make a lot of really important assertions about horary, which I will labor to do justice to. But he was saying that people would come to him and they would ask him how to make choices in a way that sometimes suggested to him that they wanted to avoid their destiny. And this isn't a context in which he would say we can change our fate, but we can't change our destiny. Because what he was referring to is the energetic influence of planets. And I remember him saying, and I can't say for sure that he said it, but I can only say for sure that I remember him saying that the consciousness of a planet is huge, right? Like if you think, and I'm paraphrasing now, if you think about the amount of influence that you as an individual being can have on Earth in various different contexts, then I would say probably a lot of those contexts make it feel like you can't have much influence at all. Right? So like on Earth, I can pick up a cup. I would call that a possibility. On Earth, I can pick up this cup. I would call that a choice. And on Earth, I can pick up this cup now, or 5 seconds from now, or 10 seconds from now. I can't pick it up 5 minutes ago, because I would say the way that I perceive time and the way that I can make choices in time is karmically shaped such that it's very, very difficult for me to do things in the past that I haven't done already. But I can make a choice at a particular time to enact a different timeline. And I would say that in doing that, I would be enacting a fate. Or I would be enacting a timeline which belongs to a group of timelines, which can be roughly grouped as like one of many fates. But if I try to change, let's say, like what's happening in the part of the world which is known as the Levant, that's very difficult for me to do. And you might say that like it's very difficult for me to change the destiny of the part of Earth known as the Levant. It's very hard for me to even change the fate of the part of Earth known as the Levant. And if I were to say, like, well, I want to build a house on this piece of land, then I'd say that's very difficult too. But I feel like what I'm pointing to is like what Jonwin meant from my perspective when he said that it's very hard for us to like counteract the influence of a planet, and how that can be hard on very different levels, and also how time and choice and possibility relate to each other. Does anyone have any questions about that? Please feel free to ask them. I'll come back to them. But overall, I feel like y'all can see possibly what he meant by it's very hard for us to counter the energy of a planet. And then you can, I'll say, extrapolate that to countering the energy of planets that we don't even physically occupy. I'll say physically occupy because I'll say that many of us, including those people who are in this container right now listening, and those who may listen afterwards, probably, I'll say, metaphysically occupy some of the planets and some of the stars that we refer to in the practice of astrology or in the practice of astronomy or astrophysics, which is to say that I believe that their etheric souls are contiguously included in the space and time fabrics of planets and asteroids and stars that we refer to in the practice of astrology and astronomically. But their physical bodies, which is to say, like the parts of like their vaster selves, which we recognize as being physical on an interpersonal level, or what we often call an empirical level, or on, you could say, like a felt level, only occupy Earth. So if you can see how hard it is for us to change or work against the influence of Earth in all these different contexts, you can possibly imagine how difficult it is within the perspective that Jonwin was talking about to counteract the influence of these different planets and stars. And I would say that in some ways he was talking about gravity, right? Or weight, which is to say the effect of gravity upon our mass, which is the physical stuff of our existence, not the metaphysical stuff. So you could probably see how like my mass or like the physical stuff of my existence relates to my ability to change all of the things that I mentioned in all of those different contexts about changing the energy of a planet on Earth or working against the energy of a planet on Earth, right? Like if I was tiny, like if I was an ant, I could probably not pick up this cup in the future or in the past or any time. And ants are really strong. But, you know, the mass of an ant is such that even like an army of ants would probably struggle to pick up a cup, whether or not it had liquid in it, whether or not it was made out of a light material or a material with low density, or a cup which had low mass, or whether it was made out of a dense material, which is to say that it would be a cup of high mass. Because the mass of those ants, even though they're considered to be very strong for their mass, is very small compared to the mass of the cup. And you could say that if you extrapolate to the context about like me or any one person who is not Bibi Netanyahu changing the fate of the part of the world known as the Levant, you could say that like my mass compared to that land mass is very small. And that influences my ability to work against the energy of what's happening in that landmass, including the landmass that relates to the people who are occupying that land. But then also, I would say, by invoking the example of Bibi Netanyahu, I would say that it's not just about mass, right? In the sense that it's not only our mass which determines our ability to have an influence on a body which may or may not have equivalent mass to us. And I would say that the influence that Bibi Netanyahu has on the landmass that we refer to as the Levant is boosted by his physical and metaphysical status. Does that make sense for y'all? How does this relate to fate and destiny? Well, first I would say that it is fair, I would say, for Jonwin to say that it's difficult for us to fight against the energy of a planet such as Saturn, which I think is the example that he used when he was talking about this, based purely on mass alone. And I think it would also be fair to say that I believe when he was talking about this, I remember when he was talking about this, but I can't be sure, that he also left room for the possibility that some people would be able to do battle energetically against the energy of a planet like Saturn, regardless of their lack of mass relative to the body of Saturn. And I remember him making room for this possibility in a way that gestured not at the practice of Chinese astrology, but at the practice of qigong, which translates more or less literally to the art of cultivating one's inner fire, which I've also talked about in a past episode of Why Am I Like This? And stepping outside of the container of my experience of what he said, I'll say that by cultivating our inner fire, we can increase our metaphysical influence in a way that often increases our physical influence in the form of acquiring status, such that we can have a bigger physical and metaphysical influence, not only on the energies of other planets, but on the energy of the planet that we occupy in our physical vessel. Which is to say that when we are cultivating health in our bodies in a way that allows us to cultivate health in the social or communal bodies that we occupy and in the planetary bodies that we occupy, I would say that we can often have more of an influence on the fate and the destiny of those bodies, whether they're individual bodies or social/communal bodies, or even planetary bodies. And of course, I would say that there are ways of acquiring status which do not align with improving the health of individual or social communal bodies or planetary bodies. But I would say that I enjoy practicing the art of cultivating health in inner and social, communal, and planetary bodies. And I'll say that the way that I choose to cultivate health in my individual body increases my ability to change my fate, which is to say, make choices which put me on cosmic timelines, or I would say, allow me to more discerningly and with higher capacity choose the timelines within the ones which are made available to me, which are aligned with health for me and the bodies that I'm a part of. And that I would say that for me, the difference between fate and destiny is somewhat arbitrary. Like, I don't think that there is like an interpersonal definition within the body of humanity or within the bodies of intelligences which are extraterrestrial as to what the difference between fate and destiny are. I would say that it maps pretty like fuzzily onto the framework which I put forward before about the difference between picking up a cup now or picking up a cup at some point in the future, or being able to pick up a cup or not, or being able to pick up a cup in the past. Which is to say that I don't think that fate and destiny can be defined without a semiotic base. And I feel like the only way to define them in a way which is not, I would say, distortive, is to say that you could refer to fate as the things that you can change, and you could refer to destiny as the things that you can't change, which would be tautological, right? Because if you substitute that meaning into, quote, the saying, unquote, then you're basically saying that we can change the things we can change, but we can't change the things that we can't change. Which makes the saying, I would say, pretty silly and sort of robs the saying of the gravity that might have been attached to it. But to go back to, like, I'll say, the container that I learned this saying in, and I would say to give it due reverence and to honor the work of Jonwin and the work that was done in that container. First, I'll say that to me it's very useful to point out uses of astrology which give us more power to change our experience. And I would say that it's more or less correct to me that for the most part, the practice of natal astrology tends to cause people to identify with egregores which have been associated with different stars and planetary placements and different housing placements in different housing systems, such that it gives people less agency and reduces the number of things that they can change about their experience, and often commits them to experiences. I think I want to point out that I'm like very carefully not saying fates or destinies, but experiences that they don't enjoy and that lead to higher karmic accumulation. And I would say for some people, it can help them to be pinned into experiences which they do enjoy, but I would say also lead to higher karmic accumulation. Perhaps not for them, but often at other people's expense or at the expense of other beings, let's say animals and plants, or at the expense of the planetary body of Earth, and sometimes at the expense of the consciousness of other bodies or other planetary bodies or other bodies on different planetary bodies, mostly in different timelines. But I would say that the practice of horary can also have that effect, because it can also be used to bring in egregores, which results in the accumulation of karma, which results in people making choices that lead to more karmic accumulation and not less karmic accumulation. And I would say that across all lineages of astrology, it's very rare for astrology to be used in ways that help people to release karma that limits the experiences they can have. And I feel like there's a way in which I would say like previous versions of myself, which is to say like versions of myself which hadn't resolved a lot of karma, would feel kind of obligated or incentivized to talk about how all of the different planets sort of like winnow down our possibility space from like the outer ring to the inner ring, right? So often people talk about Saturn as being a boundary planet which controls time. And I would say that the way that applies for me from a metaphysical perspective is that each of these planets exerts a vibrational influence on the sound or the music of the spheres in our solar system. And the sound or the music of the spheres in our solar system creates like a shape, and that shape filters out possibilities, or you could say terma, or hyperdimensional geometries or codes, so that only a subset of possible hyperdimensional geometries or codes or terms or possibilities or choices or timelines make their way into the spirit of each and every being on earth. Does that make sense for y'all? I feel like probably most of the people who are here live can map this to what Julie and Adam were saying about fate being a fraction of destiny, or fate and destiny occupying different parts of the spectrum between zero possibilities and infinite possibilities. But I'll also say that the reason I prefaced what I just said by saying that a previous version of myself would feel obligated to or incentivized to explain things in that way is because I feel like in the process of holding space for this container and the transmission of the vaster self that I call Red Star Green Cloud, or Nobu the Elder, or the heart complex of the astral body that I know as Sekhmet, I would say that I cleared a bunch of karma that causes the need to be, let's say, like only overly specific and discursive in service of accuracy, which is to say that probably a lot of people who are listening will not understand what I just said, which is not to, I'm not like fluffing y'all, but I feel like y'all have metaphysical capacities that a lot of people don't have. And also, like, y'all are in a container that we call the broom, where we talk about these things all the time, where we've been developing the capacity to have discussions of this complexity and nuance, and I'll say accuracy, but please disagree. And I would say that people who are not in this container probably don't have quite the same metaphysical capacity, or I would say like their metaphysical asses would have gotten them into the broom a long time ago. And some of them probably have really high lexical and neural capacity, but their lexical and neural capacity has not been expanded by their presence in the broom because they're probably not here yet. Which is all to say that I think it's better in current time for the people who may listen to this to talk about how the practice of astrology, as commonly practiced, can cause us to overly identify with things that people say about different planets in ways that cause karma to accumulate for ourselves and for other beings, which I would say constrain the possibility space of our experience and therefore make Earth and our lives and the lives of the other beings on Earth less entertaining for the body of the one, less joyful, less pleasurable. I would say that there are some cases where individual bodies get enjoyment from the practice of astrology at the expense of other bodies in the body of the One, such that the experience overall for all of the beings in the body of the One is less entertaining, less joyful, and less pleasurable. And I would say that the same applies, sometimes even more so, to all of the ideas that we are indoctrinated in. And I want to give ashe to the idea that astrology can constrain our karma in all of the ways that I talked about, but also lead to us having or accumulating or reifying less karma than the other thought control systems, I'll say, that we're indoctrinated into. Which is to say that most people who are even familiar with the practice of astrology are probably less karmically obstructed than people who are not. Which is to say, yes, that our education systems, our mainstream media, even our alternative media, all have the same, sometimes less, but probably mostly more of a karmic impact on our existence and the existence of other beings than even astrology does. And I would say that all methods of thought control, which I tend to call demons or thought form complexes, tend to reduce our power and our influence over our fate and our destiny. And I would say that this is why cultivating inner fire, or cultivating qi or qi, or cultivating some form of movement and or meditation-based practice is important for releasing ourselves and other beings from the obstruction of karma, so that we can have more influence on our bodies and on the communal and social bodies that we are parts of, and the planetary bodies that we are parts of. And I'll say that if you are interested in cultivating your awareness or your ki or your chi or your sense of presence in this way, then I invite you to join the Broom. I invite you to book sessions with some of the people who are most active in the Broom. I invite you to book sessions with me. And if you would like to find out how to join the Broom, please see the links in the description of this episode. If you would like to find out how to support Why Am I Like This, please see the links in the description of this episode, and hopefully they'll work. I'm just going to read out a little bit in the chat. There is some Nicki and Cardi B discussion. So if you want to take part in discussions relating to like Nicki Minaj, Cardi B, not Megan, because I think we deaded her in the Broom, but then you can also follow the links in the description to join the Broom. Adam says, on a more spiritual adjacent topic, slightly more spiritual adjacent topic than Nicki Minaj and Megan Thee Stallion's beef, Adam says, when you said spirit and affecting every living thing on earth, I thought of prana /chi /pneuma. And he included a screenshot of, I think it's a Wikipedia article, which to me is changing what I said previously about the way that sayings are presented and the amount of influence they have on our perception, because it typically appears in a sans serif font, and then it has this like nice color of blue, which it associates with like hyperlinks, which I feel like connote to me that, you know, this article has been well researched and put together, and that makes it change my perception slightly more. But what it says is pneuma is an ancient Greek word for, quote, breath, unquote, and in a religious context for, quote, spirit, unquote, or, quote, soul, unquote. It has various technical meanings for medical writers and philosophers of classical antiquity, particularly in regard to physiology, and is also used in Greek translations of ruach in the Hebrew Bible and in the Greek New Testament. Yes, I'm glad that there was mention of ruach there because I felt it was remiss of me not to also talk about cultivation of ruach. I did not think about pneuma, but I would say that the cultivation of all of these, I would say like terms that gesture at the idea of vitality or life force, the cultivation of all of these forms of life force is likely to change what we might call our fate. And I would say for some people would even help us to cultivate the influence, including the status that we might need in order to change not only our destinies, but collective destinies. Yeah, Adam's saying I love vitality slash life force. I've been kind of like moving towards calling it life force more often just because of all the things I've said previously about, I would say like people's metaphysical priming. Like if you go up to like Bob with the truck nuts and say like, hey, like, do you want to cultivate ki? He'd be like, oh, like, is that like, he'd be like, how much for a gram? Maybe. I don't know, but it would be confusing, right? Like, but if I said, how do you feel about cultivating life force? He'd be like, oh, like I can relate to that. Maybe. Maybe if somebody else said it, I don't know. Depends on the Bob. I'm gonna guess if he had truck nuts, maybe he has a sense of humor. But I can also imagine a lot of people I'll go up to and be like, how do you feel about life force? And I'd be like, fuck you, chink. Anyway. But I think we're gonna need all of the Bobs, whether they're racist or not, or whether they have trucks or indeed truck nuts or not, in order to like make meaningful shifts to both the fate and the destiny of our planet. Adam says the truck nuts may be compensating for a lack of vitality, and I cannot disagree. But with that, I'm going to close the container and I'll say thank you, Lexi, for the offering of this question. Thank you to y'all for all of your offerings. I really enjoyed myself. And yeah, please see the show notes for information on how to join us in the Broom Radio for live sessions or how to support the people who cultivate the broom. And I'll see y'all at some point in the future. Although, if I cultivate my inner fire enough, I may see y'all in the past. Peace.